If you're not building a business that's trying to grow for the sake of growing, there's a lot of room for you to keep on working on the tasks that you enjoy, even if they're not necessarily improving the bottom line.
Welcome to Entrepreneur's Handbook, where we share inspiring startup stories with practical takeaways for you, the listener. Today I've got with me Anne-Laure, the founder of Ness Labs. Say hi.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So, for the audience who are unaware of your background and how you got to where you are, what made you become an entrepreneur in the first place?
I started working in tech at Google right after university. And at the time, working on your own startup was the kind of like normal next step after working at a big tech company. So after a few years at Google, I left. I worked on a couple of startups, and then I realized that that was absolutely not what I wanted to do with my life. But the problem was not the entrepreneurship itself. It was the startup model. I was not necessarily comfortable with the idea of raising a bunch of money, creating a whole new set of bosses and managers for myself, because that's what investors are really, and having to follow that Silicon Valley playbook. So I then started my current company, which is completely bootstrapped. It's just me. I have a few employees, but I've never raised money. It's all sustainable from a financial standpoint. And it's kind of a different way to approach entrepreneurship that I didn't really think about when I was still working in Silicon Valley. So that's how I ended up here.
Do you feel like you almost started your company because you thought it was the next step or because other people were doing it, rather than you had an idea that you wanted to then make live?
Yeah, absolutely. The first company I worked on after Google, I did it for all of the wrong reasons. I did it because that's what everyone was doing around me. You worked at Google or Apple or Facebook or one of these companies for a few years, and then you left, raised money, and worked on a startup. And I did care about the idea. It was a startup looking at helping people with diabetes. Created a chatbot that was all the rage at the time, chatbots.
Yeah.
That was helping people with their diets, because my mom and my grandma both had diabetes. But if I'm being completely honest with myself, and I had to become honest with myself after a little while, even though I cared about the idea, the reason why I started the startup was because I thought that that's what I had to do. That was the next step in my career, and not necessarily because I really wanted to work on a startup.
How hard was it to stop the startup and give up on it and to go into Ness Labs and do something different? Was there some kind of identity crisis there?
Yes, after a year working on my startup, I realized that that was not the right path for me, and I was completely lost, because until this day, I had a very clear path. I knew what the next step was supposed to be. It almost felt like an elevator in front of you, or a staircase, where you just take the next step. And whenever you take that next step, the next one is right in front of you. You almost don't really have to think, basically. And it was the first time that I decided to get off the elevator and stop for a moment and ask myself, what is it that I really want to do? And I didn't start Ness Labs straight away. I didn't go from the startup to figuring out that I wanted to be a bootstrapped entrepreneur. Instead, I went back to school. I was, again, so lost that I asked myself, what is something that you would want to do even if you were not being paid for it, if there was no money involved, no recognition, none of that, just for the intrinsic value and pleasure of doing that thing? And I had always been interested in the brain, how the mind works. So I decided at the ripe age of 28 to go back to university to study neuroscience. And that was before Ness Labs.
It's obviously quite a different path to people in the startup world. And you often hear people saying about where you don't have to go to university or you shouldn't do those kind of things. Do you feel like within your own peer group, you got some kind of pushback, or were people supportive around you about your decision?
People were very confused. If you looked at my path at the time, I left a really good job at Google to then do a startup, which could have worked out pretty well. But then I stopped that too, and I went back to school. And you're not normally supposed to go back to school. The normal way of doing things in the right order is school, then work, not then school again. So people were confused, but once they saw that I was a lot happier, a lot more fulfilled, that I looked a lot more excited to wake up in the morning and to work on the stuff that I was working on, I feel like they understood that that was the right decision for me. But yes, there was definitely pushback. My parents were really confused. They felt like they had supported me in my childhood while I did my studies. So they were like, why do you want to study more? So I feel like it can be difficult sometimes when you're taking a different direction than the one that is expected from you, from society, to explain to the people around you that this is the right choice for you.
Yeah, and like once you started like your course again, when did the idea for Ness Labs kind of come about to think, oh, maybe I could make this into a business or this could be my career?
I didn't think of Ness Labs as a business straight away, kind of emerged after a while. So what happened is that while I was studying neuroscience, I discovered something called the generation effect. And it's basically a phenomena in your mind that shows that by creating your own version of something that you're studying, you're going to both understand it and remember it better. Creating your own version could be any kind of form of creation. It could be rewriting it into your own words. It could be like this, recording a podcast about the topic that you're studying, doing a YouTube video, teaching it to other people. It doesn't really matter. The idea is that instead of just trying to learn things by heart, try to recreate your own version of it. So to make use of the generation effect, I started a little newsletter, which at the beginning was mostly my former colleagues and my dad, probably. That's it. Very few people, but it acted as a forcing mechanism for me to write every week about what I was studying at school. And to make it more interesting for myself, instead of just writing about what I was studying, I would ask myself, how can I make this practical and useful? How can I turn this neuroscience knowledge that I'm getting into strategies, ideas, models that can be used at work and in life? And after only a few weeks, I had a few thousand subscribers. A few of the articles I wrote for my newsletter went mini viral, not big viral, but very surprising still for me and very encouraging. And I had people who started reaching out and asking me, can I sponsor your newsletter? Can I promote my product to your audience? And that's when I thought, oh, maybe there's a business here.
Yeah, because it's quite interesting. I think we've got a similar path in some ways so I started writing in January 2020. And it's a similar thing. I didn't think many people would actually read it. It was more about me trying to process my own thoughts, my learnings. And for me, it came from my karate background and I had loads of different influences from different places. And it was kind of a mush in my brain. So I wanted to kind of write it down in a way that other people could understand. And like I said, I think if you write things down in a way that teaches other people how to make it useful, it takes a deeper level of understanding to do that. And that's what I was trying to get. And similar thing where it went quite viral early and it was a massive surprise to me. And in many ways, sometimes that it's not luck, but it's unexpected. Actually takes you down a really happy path that you would have never thought of. And maybe because you didn't put the pressure on yourself to try to get, how can I get as many followers as I can? How can I get as many like subscribers as I can? Meant that you just did something that was quite wholesome that really made a difference to people.
I absolutely agree. I think too many people make the mistake, and I did with my first startup, of trying to follow a playbook. They think that if they apply a specific recipe, they're going to get a specific result. But the truth is that in entrepreneurship and any kind of work that requires a little bit of creativity, there's also a lot of luck involved. And while you cannot predict when you're going to be lucky, the only thing that you can do is making sure that you show up consistently so that when luck does show up, you're here. So it does help a lot to actually be passionate and curious about the topic that you're exploring in your work, because even if it takes a long time for you to get lucky with work, at least it's enjoyable. You're still happy to show up every day, to do the work and to share it with the world, even if it's a very small audience at the beginning.
Yeah, it's the whole thing, for example, with people who have side hustles and hobbies. And if you think about it as a side hustle from the start, sometimes it takes you away from why you're actually doing it, what you actually enjoy. Whereas if it's a hobby that you're doing because you love it, and then later on the monetization comes, then I think it feels much more gratifying because, like, well, you're doing what you want to do and people are liking that. And did you ever feel the pressure once you started to get more subscribers and once people wanted to sponsor you? Did that change your relationship with the newsletter? Did you find it harder to write once you knew there's actually a lot of people reading this?
It was actually interesting having to consider now what my audience wanted versus just thinking about what I wanted to write about. And I did experiment for a little while with trying to figure out what would be good topics to write about. I installed some SEO tools and I started looking at what would be ideas that would bring me more traffic. But I didn't last very long doing this because I found it incredibly boring trying to figure out the right keywords and writing about topics I didn't really care about, because apparently this tool was telling me that this was the long tail that would allow me to get that magical traffic. I hated it. I absolutely hated it. So I just stopped doing that, and I kept on writing about things that I was curious about. I was generally just looking at the conversations I had that week, the books that I had read, the podcasts that I had listened to, and pulling ideas out of all of those different areas in my life to decide what I would write about. And I think that's been really helpful in the long run, because it means that I've never missed a newsletter. I've always showed up consistently. I don't even know how many newsletters I have now, but like it's hundreds, I think. Mm-hmm. I would have not been able to do that if it felt like a grind, and if it felt like I had to produce content like a robot based on variables that I didn't really care about.
I think what's the interesting things about personal branding, where a lot of people take this idea that you have to like follow the stats and like you have to experiment and look at the numbers and see what happens. And people do this on Twitter, they do it on YouTube, whatever. And they're saying, oh, this one did well, so I need to make more content like that. And you should keep going down that niche. But the problem with that is, in some ways, I think there's so many other variables where it's not just because of that topic. It's also that one happened to be shared by somebody who's really big, and you can't fully explain everything. And when you start going down that route, like you said, you can go further away from what you're actually curious about. And I find as well, so the people who are going to follow you in the long term, they've got to be coming for you because they like the way that you think. And if you're trying to chase your tail in a way, you're trying to do what you think they're going to like, then it doesn't really match up, because then you've got to kind of almost, you're pretending to be somebody else or pretending you're caring about something more than you do. And that's just not sustainable. And I think it's a problem where, especially when people are new to the content world, they're thinking about how can they get the quick wins, rather than, do I want to be still doing this in a few years' time? Or will I hate this in a few years' time? And like I said, you've done hundreds of newsletters now. And have you ever thought, like, where like there's a few that you've done where like this one really stands out, like you really love that idea and you got good feedback on it? Have you got like favorites in that way?
I am really bad at predicting what's going to do well. So this is also why following your curiosity is a good way to go about it, because even if people don't care about it, at least I had fun creating it. One of my most popular ones is about time anxiety, which is the fear that you're not using your time in the best way possible, in the most productive way possible, and that you're not creating enough meaning with the way you spend your time. That's something that I've felt a lot in my life that I still kind of battle with sometimes, and it resonated with a lot of people. And to come back to what you were saying earlier, because it is relevant also to time anxiety, a good question to ask yourself, I think, is what game are you playing? What game are you winning? Because you may be on the path of winning a game, but is that really the one you're interested in? And you hear that a lot with content creators, as you were saying, finding themselves absolutely alienated and feeling like almost a puppet to their audience, creating the content that people are expecting, but not the content that they care about. So I think a good way to deal with both time anxiety and that sentiment of alienation is to think of it as a Venn diagram. What is the overlap between what you care about and what your audience cares about?
Yeah. And have you found as well where with the time anxiety side of things, that it's almost, it doesn't matter what you do in some ways, because if you're ambitious, so you set yourself these high targets, it doesn't matter if you're an employee, it doesn't matter if you're an entrepreneur or creator, you can always feel that kind of time anxiety. And I think sometimes people make the decision to maybe work with themselves thinking they can overcome that time anxiety. And it's not necessarily the case, because as you know as well, like there's all these other tasks that come along with it. And people sometimes see the glamorous side of you get to do this, or you get to do that, but it's all the back end stuff that nobody sees. And it's not very interesting to post about, but that can sometimes suck your time. And you said that you've hired people as well. So how did you make that decision to hire people to manage your time better, or like to know what to delegate and what to keep for yourself?
I actually had never thought about it as a way to manage time anxiety, but now that you say it, I think you're right. There was part of it, probably unconsciously, that was thinking about what is the best use of my time and what is the most enjoyable use of my time. And while Ness Labs was growing, there were more and more tasks that needed to be done, a growing community with lots of members who needed help and support and content to create, the sponsors to manage, all of these kinds of projects that I suddenly had on my plate, though I started with just a few people on the newsletter. So I tried to find people to hire that were going to be better than me at these things and enjoying them more, so I could focus on where I could add the most value. And it's been incredibly helpful to do that because I feel like I'm less tired, less stressed, and that I still have an incredibly high level of joy from the work that I do every day for Ness Labs, which in itself I think is a really good accomplishment after a few years.
You mentioned there about like, what's the most valuable use of your time. And sometimes the most valuable use of your time versus what you enjoy doesn't actually match up. And I think it's a problem for many entrepreneurs where you really enjoy doing a certain task, but you know that you really should outsource it if you're thinking about it from a business perspective. And one of the things I think I'm doing right now, I'm not really profit maximizing. I'm kind of following what I enjoy, and I'm lucky enough and privileged enough to be in that position. But how do you find that balance? And like, what do you kind of advise people listening where, let's say they really enjoy a task, but it's kind of stopping them from growing their business? And I think in some ways it's easier for a small, but once you've got a bigger business, so you've got like 50 employees, 100 employees, then it's like, well, are you serving the business or yourself? And I think that's quite a difficult paradox for many people.
That's super interesting because I think when I talk about value, I intrinsically add the enjoyment as part of it. I think there's value in just finding joy in the work that you do. I think that the fact that I don't have shareholders also helps in the sense that I don't necessarily have to maximize financial value for the company. I just want it to be sustainable, to make sure that I can pay all of the people that I work with in a good way, but I'm not necessarily trying to grow 10% year on year. So I try to think of tasks that I enjoy, but that are not necessarily directly linked to the success of the business as little treats. And I feel like if you're not building a business that's trying to grow for the sake of growing, there's a lot of room for you to keep on working on the tasks that you enjoy, even if they're not necessarily improving the bottom line. So that works for the kind of business that I've built. But obviously, that kind of advice is not necessarily helpful if you've raised money and if you have built the kind of company that really needs to grow. And I don't think that has anything to do with the size of the company itself, because I know of other founders that have hundreds of employees, but it's the same because they haven't raised. They don't need to seek growth for the sake of growth, and they can still decide to work on things like a podcast, for example, or things like that are really hard to track and connect to the business growth, but that they deeply enjoy.
Yeah, and because you mentioned before you did go down that more venture path and then you turned away from it. Do you ever think if you were like back after you left Google, was there anything that you might have done differently if you knew what you did today? Like if you had all of the knowledge, so you'd learned all the lessons, would you have like stayed at Google longer? Would you have gone into more of like study sooner? Would you have done anything different?
Yes, I would have started with side projects. At the time, I thought because of all of the books that I was reading and because I was part of the Y Combinator company, going to all Y Combinator community, going to all of the meetups, and basically I was feeding my mind with all of the traditional startup advice that you find out there, which is interesting that I call it traditional now, but it wasn't considered traditional at the time. It was considered completely new, innovative, cutting edge. And everyone was sharing the narrative of the startup hero, the founder who are quitting their jobs, quitting everything and just throwing themselves into the work of their startup, and where the startup becomes their lives. Now, if I had to start all over again, I would have stayed at Google a little bit longer, made more money while I was there because it was a well-paid job, as most of them are in these big companies. And I would have experimented with side projects just to see what I like, what I don't like, see what I can learn, and kind of test different ideas. Again, trying to find that Venn diagram between the value I get personally from working on a project and the value I can bring to the world.
And have you got any side projects you're working on now, like alongside Ness Labs? Because you obviously have different strands and you've got different curiosities as well.
I used to have a lot of little side projects. I don't have that many anymore. I have more learning projects at the time, at the moment, that are not directly linked to work. So I'm, practicing drawing. I just bought a ukulele, but I have so many work projects because I'm running Ness Labs. I'm doing my PhD. I have quite a few things going on with work. So I'm trying consciously now to find hobbies and activities on the side that are not full side projects and that are completely different and as useless as possible, basically, is my motto at the moment for side projects.
I don't think learning the ukulele is useless.
Yes, yeah. As
it's an important life skill.
I absolutely agree. You're right. But yeah, as non-work related as possible.
Yeah. And I think it's really important to have that separation. And I think it's something which sometimes comes to people over time. At the beginning, there's that passion and but it's not sustainable to kind of burn yourself out that much. You need something which is totally unrelated. And I feel like this happens to me when I talk to some younger people as well, where they're saying, oh yeah, I don't need a hobby because I love what I do so much. Wait a little bit longer when you get more stress and you've got either investors or employees or all these different things that come in, because the business is so much more about just than what it produces. And you just need a break from it sometimes. And for example, with social circles, I think it's really important to have friends who aren't entrepreneurs as well, who maybe are completely unrelated to what you do. Just you can have normal conversation and something that takes your mind off of it. Whereas I know some people struggle with that. They kind of always switched on. And a lot of your work talks about burnout as well and how to avoid that. When do you think you've burnt out in the past? Was it when you were building a startup? Was even on Ness Labs? Because I know I've had this problem myself where I talk a lot about burnout and how to avoid it. But then as I'm doing that content, sometimes I'm burning out building that content. So how do you stop yourself from going down your own rabbit hole, I guess?
Yeah, I've experienced burnout several times in my life at Google, on my startup. I don't think I've fully probably burned out working at Ness Labs, but I've come really close sometimes. I've just become a little bit better at seeing it coming. So maybe it was burnout, but definitely not as bad as it was when I had it before at Google and on my startup. What's also really interesting is that lots of people assume that you burn out because you're working on stuff that you don't like. Whereas I haven't found that to necessarily be true. I really cared actually about my job at Google while I was there. I cared about my first startup. I care a lot about my work at Ness Labs. And actually, maybe it's because of that sometimes I end up burning out because I'm giving it everything. I'm making it a priority. And and it's what I do when I burn out is actually what I look for now when I want to see the symptoms and try to fix it before it becomes too bad. So something I try to really pay attention to, and I journal a lot. That's one of my main tools, is when I start making work such a priority that I cancel other things that are good for my mental health. So, for example, I know that spending time with my friends is good for my mental health. If I start noticing that I cancel plans with friends to keep on working late on something, then that's a really bad sign. I also know that exercise is good for me. If I stop going to the gym because I just want to work one more hour on this thing and then, this project can be done and I make sure I don't miss a deadline. Again, it's kind of fine if it happens one time, but usually if I start doing this, it's never one time. I ended up doing it more and more. And then I look back and it's been a week. I haven't been to the gym. I haven't exercised, even though paradoxically, it's something that I know is really good for my mental health. So I'm kind of sabotaging myself. So my only it's not even a technique, but it's paying attention to what I do. This is why for me, journaling, writing it out is really good because it helps me see the patterns and not having this big blur where sometimes you think you went to the gym yesterday, but actually it's been a week. So writing it down has been really, really helpful for me.
I think it happens to me as well with maybe a lot of entrepreneurs is that you lack the structure because when you've got a 9-to-5 job or something like that, you have it's more routine in some ways. Whereas every day this week is totally different for me. So then time goes a lot faster and sometimes you don't realize, I haven't done this in a while. I haven't done that in a while. And like you said, the journaling or some kind of way of recording that is really useful. And looking at that as well, where you've built with a neuroscience aspect as well. How much do you think it's changed the way you view different things? Like, what's some of the biggest changes in the way you've seen stuff where you can look at yourself pre your PhD and your studying and be like, oh, that was really unhealthy the way I used to think?
Yeah, I think the main thing that I've discovered while studying for my master's and now my PhD is the concept of metacognition, thinking about thinking. And I think the worst thing I did, and this is the underlying problem for most of the problems that I had before, is that I was acting and doing everything on autopilot. I was just doing things because that's what was expected from me. That's what was normal, quote unquote, because someone put it in my calendar. So I would show up at a meeting, it's in my calendar. Someone asked me to do something, so I would just do it. And a lot of my life, without realizing it, was defined by the expectations of other people. And obviously we live in a society where social animals. And so I'm not saying that just do whatever you want. You can't in lots of situations. In most situations, you can't, whether you're a manager, you're an employee, you're a parent, you're a teacher, wherever you are, whatever your position is, and you usually have all of these different hats in society, you do have to do things based on what other people want from you. But it doesn't have to be everything. And you don't have to live on autopilot. And I can understand sometimes that because life can be exhausting, it feels easier to just rely on whatever people ask you to do or want from you to make your decisions. But it's a lot better for you, your mental health, and even for building meaning into your life if you take a little bit of time to practice metacognition, to think about the way you think, and to make sure that you're thinking these thoughts yourself and not because someone put them into your head.
Yeah, I think I definitely resonate with that as well, because one thing I try to do is I reassess my long-term plans often. So I know sometimes people set their goals at the beginning of the year, whereas I look at that list and see, do I still want to do that? Or have I actually changed and now this is more exciting to me? And I think sometimes people trap themselves with the expectations of a past version of themselves. And like, why am I doing this? Or do I actually still care about this? Or am I just doing it just because I've done it before? And I think it's quite a tough experience for many people to question themselves in that way. And like you said, it's easy to just keep doing what you've been doing or what other people expect of you. And one of the hardest things I find about entrepreneurship or working for myself is the amount of decisions you have to make. Because when you've got a job, it's actually, in some ways, I miss some aspects of it because someone just tells you, can you do this? And you just do it. And you don't need to think. Whereas now I need to question everything. And with the people you hire, for example, how much of that decision making have you offloaded, or are you still making sure that you're making all the strategic decisions, or you're able to let go and kind of free yourself up?
Obviously, at the very beginning, it takes a little bit of time to kind of explain what you want, what you think is good for the business. But I really tend to try and give them general directions in terms of goals and things that we want to achieve. And I actually love being surprised when they come up with a completely different way of doing things that I haven't thought about, because that's the point of hiring someone. If not, I would find a SaaS tool or any kind of automated way to just make whatever is in my head happen in an automated way. So having a human mind who's there working with you, who can surprise you, is actually really beneficial. And I think as long as we're very clear in terms of values and mission and what we want to do, the how, it's completely fine if they're creative and they do it in a different way.
And looking forward then, because you mentioned about the goals and you give your employees that idea of where you want to be, where do you want to take Ness Labs? Like, what's the ambition, or how much you want to grow it? Because obviously, like I said, you don't want funding, you don't want to have that venture scale, but I'm sure you've got ambitions and other targets you want to meet or people you want to impact.
Yeah, the good thing is, and it's a good thing I haven't raised money, because it would be really bad if I said that if I had raised money, is that I have no idea where I'm going. Absolutely no idea. And this is part of the fun. This is why I love it, that I can wake up every morning and I don't necessarily know what's the next step. In the short term, I have ideas. I know that I want to relaunch an online course. I want to restructure the community for kind of a post-pandemic era where not everyone wants to spend 24 hours online. And we built that community while everyone needed that online connection. So what does that look like now that people want to spend more time outside of their house, not on the screen? So I'm thinking about these different things at the moment, but I don't have a 5-year plan or anything like that. I have a general mission of helping people take care of their mental health at work, being productive and achieving their goals and their ambitions without burning out. But that's big enough that there's lots of room for experimentation in there. And that's actually why I call Ness Labs with the laboratory element to it, where it's more of a playground, a sandbox where I can experiment without a very clear direction or a 5-year plan.
Yeah, and if you're watching this on YouTube now, you notice we're here in person. And we were talking about this before we started recording about how much like different personalities, we enjoy the in-person interaction and we enjoy meeting people in real life. And one thing that's often flavored online when you read different forums or Twitter, for example, is how much bias there is towards people who want to do everything online. But the problem is it's kind of a bubble because the people who post online are obviously the ones who like doing stuff online the most. So you sometimes have this worldview that everybody wants to do things online, where that's not necessarily true. And some kind of thing about it as well, because my original brand was all built online because that's the only real option I had back in 2020. And I was like, how do you transition that to an in-person thing? And have you got any ideas on that of what kind of things you want to do?
So I started already, but I want to do more of these, but in-person meetups. Sounds old school, but people love them. I love them too. There's something really special about meeting people in person. I also think that next year when I can travel a little bit more, I would love to go and meet different members of the community that are in different countries and cities around the world. And even, I think a big difference between building a community versus having a one-way broadcast relationship where I'm kind of the person standing in between members of the community is that I would love to think about having chapters where people can meet up even if I'm not here, basically. That it's not necessarily around me, but just for them to make friends, to connect, work with different creators, share their strategies about mental health and mindful productivity. So I don't know exactly what that will look like, but I think having a very organic way for people to meet in person and do it in a way where they don't need to wait for me to be in town would be absolutely amazing.
Because you've obviously worked in different places and you're in London at the moment. And what has been behind some of those decisions to like live in different countries and the different opportunities you've had? And do you consider London your new home, or do you think you're going to move somewhere else in the future? Or have you got any plans on that side of?
Yeah, it's been quite a few years I'm in London, and it's starting to feel a little bit long, to be honest. I love London. I absolutely love London. But I'll probably leave.
It is the best city in the world.
It is a really good city, yes. No, I love London. It's just that I feel like I do want to move somewhere else at some point. There's something magical about arriving in a new city, not knowing many people, and having this mechanism that forces you to connect with new people, get out of your comfort zone, discover new ways of thinking, of communicating, the culture, the habits. A lot of things change about you when you move to a new city, and I haven't experienced that in a little while. In the past, I've lived in Paris and New York, San Francisco, Tokyo, and now London. And every single time I moved to these cities, I just felt like there was this little new magical wave of change, basically, that was coming on me and helping me see things in a new way. So I'd love to do that again at some point after my PhD, because I have to be in London for that, and I have 2 more years to do and finish this. But for people who can afford to do it and who have that kind of freedom, I think this is always an amazing experience to change cities or countries.
And how do you make new friends in these new cities, and how do you find new connections and interesting people? Because I know for people to move to London, often it's quite intimidating, right? It's a very big city. Lots of people already have their own friends, and it can be difficult to know where you fit in. So how did you do that? How did you go about making new friends and building up that new base? At
the time, last time I moved to another city, I used Meetup. nessLabs.com, very old school. I think nowadays you would have other ways to do it. I personally would use Twitter. The good thing about Twitter is that it's a lot of weirdos who are super happy to meet people they met on the internet. They'd be super happy to just grab coffee with someone who's in town. There's also a good chance that you'll have lots of topics in common that you can talk about that they can't talk about with their friends because they may be a little bit geeky or things that most of their friends don't care about. So I definitely use Twitter, and especially our little corner of Twitter where everyone is so friendly and everyone would be so welcoming. And then obviously growing older and having more friends, just asking around. Usually there's at least one friend of a friend of a friend who's in the city where I want to go. So it's mostly about not being shy, or rather than not being shy, because you can be shy. It's completely fine to be shy, but overcoming temporarily this shyness. So you can reach out and make a couple of friends, and then these friends can do the job of being the connectors for you.
You mentioned Twitter there as well, and you've got quite a big audience and low audience that's growing on there. How important is that to Ness Labs in terms of getting that inbound people to subscribe to your newsletter, or where did most of the subscribers come from?
I think Twitter as it is today would not exist without Twitter. I owe a lot of the growth and community engagement and readership of Ness Labs to Twitter. I haven't looked at the numbers in a very long time because I'm just generally not that interested in that. But last time I checked, I was a year ago or so, and I think it was something like 30% or 40% of the traffic on Ness Labs that was coming from Twitter, which is massive. And most of the rest was coming from Google. I would imagine that now that we have a lot more content on the website, there's probably more traffic coming from search engines, a little bit less from Twitter. But what Twitter has been really helpful in is making sure that it's the right people reading our content. It's pretty niche, right? It's at the intersection of productivity, creativity, mental health with a bit of neuroscience. So it's not, I completely understand that it may not be helpful for absolutely everyone. It's for a certain type of people who are looking at these problems in a certain kind of way. And these people, a lot of them are on Twitter. So it's a really great place for me to find them, to connect with them, to share my content, and even to make friends. I've made so many good friends through Twitter. So I'm really, really grateful for it.
So what is your Twitter for people listening who want to follow you and maybe connect with you?
Okay, you'll have to put that in the show notes because I created my Twitter handle when I was a teenager and it means absolutely nothing, but it's pronounced in French. Antilemoon is ANTHILEMOON. So that's where I am on Twitter. Way easier than that is just to go to newsletter.nesslabs.com, and that's where I send my weekly newsletter every week.
Perfect, yeah. And I think lots of people can spell that one. But yes. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thanks so much for having me.